Thank you so much, Adonis. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here for our Trauma Informed Courts from Self-Care to Teen Care webinar. This is the first of a two-part webinar series. We will be announcing the date for the second webinar at the end of this session. So thank you so much for being here with us. We're really excited that you're here. I am the Director of Behavioral Health here at the National Council. I've been here for 4 years. Prior to coming here, I was working in the school district for close to 2 decades. I also have been working in higher education the past 10 years now at Oregon State University. So for those of us who are Duck fans out there, we are already semi-enemies here because go Beavs. When I was working in the school district, so my bachelor's degree was in elementary education. I was a teacher and a school administrator for some years. And then I went back and got my master's degree in counseling. And my specific track was school counseling. I did that for over 15 years as a middle school counselor. So I have quite a bit of experience working with kids of all ages and families. And when I left the school district and came to NCJFCJ, I was having a really hard time figuring out how do I take all of these skills and transfer them from the educational setting to the justice system setting. And it took me a while until all of a sudden I had this aha moment of, I know trauma. And I have been working with trauma for a really long time. And as a community crisis supporter, I did that for 10 years. I have been in positions where on the front lines with school shootings, student completions with suicide, family completions with suicide, natural disasters, and all sorts of things. And I was pretty naive going into my counseling career when I got my master's degree that I felt like I had this magical armor that my calling was crisis. My calling was working with families in the depths of their despair. And I had this notion for the first couple of years that I wasn't going to be impacted by any of this, that I had this special armor that was going to take me through because it was my calling and I was really strong and I was going to be able to take anything that came my way. And about 5 years in, I realized that I was getting pretty burned out. And so the vicarious trauma piece is near and dear to my heart, personally and professionally. And so that's what we're really focusing on today is this idea that self-care is great, and there's a lot of things that you can do to take care of yourself for sustainable practices. We're going to talk about what that means, but really what we want to look at is moving this notion from self-care to teen care. So that's just a little bit about me, and now I'm going to pass it off to Tina so she can talk a little bit about her.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'm Tina Kimmel. I am a retired deputy court administrator. I started back in 1988. Don't do the math on that. And I recently retired, but I've worked in the court system starting from juvenile court, working in family law, working in criminal courtrooms, all with court staff, court reporters, interpreters. And then I got into administration and I oversaw courthouses and I worked in superior courts. I worked in limited jurisdiction. I worked in family law. So I have this breadth of information. And one of the things that stuck out to my career was the court. My calling, my profession was the court. But one of the things I noticed was that when I was working with the family law or the criminal courts and the death penalty cases, that we called in support for the jurors who had to listen to really heinous material, and we didn't do anything for our staff. And that became my kernel, and it turned into I went and I got my fellows. I went through the fellows program through the Institute for Court Management, and I was able to focus on vicarious trauma for the courts. So I also was in California and I was in Tucson, Arizona. So it just a wealth of knowledge from those perspectives. And Allison and I first started talking about doing this webinar, and we found kindred spirits on these topics. So we're excited to share this. I'm also the past president of NACM. So you see the NACM emblem in the corner. And we actually partnered with NCJFCJ, and our organizations really like to work hand in hand. And this also kind of came out of that joint partnership. So back to you, Allison.
Thank you, Tina. She's underselling her knowledge, by the way. She could have talked for like another 10, 15, maybe even 10 months about this. So you're in good hands today, is what we're trying to say. Just a little bit about the NCJFCJ. For those of you who don't know, we are the oldest judicial membership organization. We are going to be 90 years old this coming May. We are very proud of our work. We serve over 30,000 judges and court personnel and professionals, and annually our work positively impacts over 4 million families. So needless to say, we are all very passionate individuals that work here. We all come from various disciplines to pull in a holistic understanding of how to support family courts.
So for NACM's perspective, we are the National Association for Court Management, and our organization isn't as old, but we've been around for 40 years, and we support court professionals. And some people get mixed up with the name saying, oh, it's only for managers. It's really for all court professionals and court professional adjacent. Like I said, we partner with NCJ, FCJ, but we also partner with other organizations for limited jurisdiction, tribal courts, federal courts, as well as whatever level you are in your court organization. And our membership is about 1,900, and we're always looking for new members. And if you have any questions, my email will be at the end about our association. With that said, I want to get through and start our presentation. We actually did say that this was going to be a 90-minute webinar. We are only going to be about 60 minutes, so we want to give you 30 minutes back in your schedules, precious time. And maybe you can start implementing some of the ideas that we have in our webinar. So with that said, let's talk about what we're actually going to be talking about today. It's really important, as you've heard, that Allison and I are very passionate about this subject, and we want people to really understand kind of what that trauma is, what trauma means, what does it look like, what are some of the core concepts, so that way you are aware of it. And then it's not just about the people we serve, because we do talk a lot about that. It's also about us, and we want to make sure we're recognizing the warning signs of that. And then we talked about tips for self-care as well, and then how to move, as Allison mentioned, from that self-care, but towards the team approach. So those are the things that we're going to try to cover in the 60 minutes. And again, if you have questions, we'll try to get to them at the end. So our first objective, we want to explain the importance of understanding trauma. And that, to me, and again, it might be high level. We don't really know what your guys' knowledge is, high level, low. Even if you are as knowledgeable as Allison on the subject, it's always a good refresh. And so we kind of wanted to at least start off this webinar with why we feel it's important to understand some of these basic concepts. So when I was doing I did my ICM paper on vicarious trauma, and a lot of it is thinking about how we can, that was more about our staff, but when we talk about being in a trauma-informed court, that's a little bit different. Allison has a few slides a little bit later on talking about the differences between trauma-informed and trauma-responsive. But informed just means, do you know what it is? Do you understand it? And are you making sure that when the people that are coming to our court, they're not being re-traumatized? They're not having issues come back stronger because they're already coming in with issues that they have to deal with within our environment. So we want to make sure that we're not re-traumatizing. It doesn't mean we're eliminating trauma. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about trauma informed, but it's really kind of just being aware of it and trying to mitigate it and recognizing it. So I loved this picture because in my mind, when we started talking about this concept, it was more about how do the people that are looking into the court, see, he's outside the window looking in. What does the public see when they're dealing with our staff? And how are our staff responding to those individuals that are coming to court, like this child or that child's family? How are we responding to them? And in that interaction between the two. So I kind of started off a little bit and started talking about who has trauma. So I'd like to hear from you all. If you can put it in the chat, who brings trauma to our court? Everyone. Throw out a few. Yeah, that's ultimately where I was getting at, everyone. But the victims, absolutely, the families, the victims, the defendants themselves, clients, absolutely. I kind of laundry listed all the areas I worked with in family law and criminal court and juvenile court. And I worked with court reporters and interpreters. Even the interpreters, if you think about it, they're dealing with trauma as well.
I wanted to highlight one of them that said, I think it was Melinda that said, all court staff bring
All
in their
court staff.
experiences. And so one of the things that we really want to highlight too is that we're always really concerned about how we're treating and working with children and with families, and to build the awareness that all of your colleagues have also brought in a lifetime worth of experiences with them as well. So this isn't just something when we're talking about the outside looking in. It's really important that we also think about internally when we're talking about moving from self-care to team care, that this isn't just this idea that a couple of people are going to be experiencing some hardships around vicarious trauma. You all will be impacted in some way.
In some way. And obviously the judges, right? We sometimes forget that the judges are up there doing their judge role, and they're such an important part of it. But they have that knowledge, they have the legal base, that information, and they're making calls. But what is the impact on them? Their takeaway at the end of the day. So wonderful. Thank you guys for sharing. Appreciate that. So I mentioned that I started my paper on vicarious trauma, and what was really interesting is when I started writing it, an HR person actually told me, we don't want to ask staff if they're being impacted by the work that they're doing, because then we're going to have to do something about it. And I think that kind of like, right in the heart, right? Because it's like, well, no, we need to look at this and address it. And so this trauma exposure, like somebody mentioned, it's all court staff. Whether you're at the front counter, whether you're taking the phone call, whether you're in the courtroom listening to the conversations within the hearings. And then you think about the case types that we deal with day in and day out. We have juvenile court, we have with abuse and neglect and juvenile delinquency cases. You have family law, where families are in conflict, crisis, protective orders, eviction calendars as well. And then the felony calendars that I was talking about, I actually oversaw the death penalty unit. And that was really hard not to want to help our staff and find ways to help our staff. So the type of work that we do, it's inherent that things are going to be traumatizing to the individuals that work in our environment.
Mm-hmm. And that builds upon our rationale. We know that trauma is prevalent no matter what. It's a universal principle at this point. And we're going to go through and look at some of the data that proves that's true. So we have to make the assumption, and it's a safe assumption to make, that everybody is going to have exposure to some type of trauma in their life. So when you say who brings trauma to court, the first answer that somebody popped in was everyone. And Tina said, essentially, yes, that's what we're trying to get to. We want to talk about the specifics, but overall, when we're looking at it in broad terms, yes, every single person has had some sort of exposure that they're bringing of their trauma that they're bringing with them. One of the important points that I always like to drive home is being trauma informed and responsive. Those are not synonyms. Those are two separate terms. But when we're talking about trauma, it doesn't excuse holding someone accountable. You all work in a system that is built off of holding people accountable and is very black and white. But the human experience is very gray. And so just because you're showing the human component or side of you, just because you're showing some compassion, doesn't mean that you're not holding the person in front of you accountable. It just means you see them as a human being for who they are. And actually, it makes things far more workable when someone feels seen. So that's a really important point that we make. I had talked a little bit about my own being naive towards vicarious trauma and my own exposure to trauma in my early years of being a counselor and a therapist. And there isn't a better way to explain it besides this quote from Rachel Raymond, which is, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as being able to walk through water without getting wet. Now, how wet we get is based off of our own individual responses and our nervous system and how our brains are wired, but we all will be impacted, and our responses to those can be somewhat low to moderate to severe. We're all different. It doesn't mean that you're not strong. It doesn't mean this isn't a calling. It doesn't mean that this isn't the job for you. It just means the constant and repetitive exposure to trauma and things that are really bad in people's lives requires a daily effort to keep your head above water.
Hey, we do want to talk about some of these core concepts of trauma. So we're throwing the word around a lot. Let's go to the American Psychologists Association. Their dictionary defines it as it's any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, disassociation, confusion, or disruptive feelings, intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitude, behavior, or other aspects of functioning. Now, this is a very broad brush, and I kind of want to focus that it's an experience. And what Allison said, it's that repetitiveness, right? We're dealing with these things on a constant. Now, somebody might be traumatized by one single incident, like say, example, a car crash. And then their behaviors are going to maybe dictate it. Maybe they don't want to drive. My mom got in a car crash many years ago. And for a while, she was like, no, you go, that's okay, you drive, because it was bad. And even like watching movies with really bad car wrecks, kind of, I could see she'd tense up. So it can have that. But again, we're trying to talk about not just that one and done, because sometimes one and done, you might not even recognize that car crash is still having an impact on you years later. Right? And then we hear all these different terms. You think about different terms, but it's not really terms, they're different things. So I like to think of it as trauma as the umbrella, and all of these different terms are more like lenses through which we're looking at the different landscapes and it might be how a person was traumatized or what the impact was or their response. So, and it might be, where is it coming from, right? So that's why I have chronic workplace listed on there. We talk about compassion fatigue, kind of more in that behavioral health realm, maybe you see that. But compassion fatigue was where I first heard that was working with problem solving courts, our drug court teams, where they sat with these individuals and the recidivism rates, because people were slipping and they kept coming back. And all of a sudden the team's resistance, like, oh, Jimmy's back again. And so that compassion fatigue became something that we talked about. And I think that was also something in my head that spawned, how does vicarious trauma look for the rest of the workplace as well? And each of these subjects and each of these topics, we could spend hours drilling down on each one of them, like generational trauma, and how does that present? Because it's not even this generation, it was past generations. What have they passed down, and what are some of the trauma around that? And Allison mentioned burnout. Her example about the armor, I see that in court professionals. I see that with courtroom clerks when they have a really bad calendar that they have to come in and listen to day in and day out. I've heard senior clerks tell younger clerks, you have to put on that protection. You have to be stoic. You have to be professional and not show any emotion. Yes, courts have to be fair and impartial, but we don't want to erase that human element. So it's how do you balance all of that? So what does our brain do when we experience trauma or that repetitive trauma? It really puts us into a survival mode. And the question becomes less about what happened, but it was like, how am I dealing with it? How am I going to be safe? And what do I need to do right now? Once our brain is kind of reacting towards trauma. It's not a failing, it's a protective measure, and it's protecting our entire nervous system. So we get a survival brain, if you will, and it becomes our amygdala and just all of these hardwired circuits firing to make sure that we're protected. And that once we see this trauma and the feelings associated with it, our system might go into fight or flight. So you've heard those terms where it's like somebody might respond angrily or aggressively or arguing, or they just any type of conflict, they're out. They're not going to engage in any type of conflict because that just it's problematic for them. But then there are other terms that we have: freeze, with if some kind of trauma comes their way or they sense anything, they're just going to freeze. They're not going to know what to do. Their just system is just going to lock up. Or they might fawn, which is that's the people pleaser person who wants to just, can't we all get along? I'll make sure, do whatever it is so that way you don't get mad at me because I don't want that to happen to me. And our brain, even though we're past that car wreck or whatever that instance was, our brain starts recognizing these patterns and starts responding accordingly. And like we said, this is cumulative. It happens over years.
Okay. Thank you, Tina. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between being trauma-informed and trauma-responsive. These terms get used interchangeably a lot, but they're very different. So one of the key things we wanted you to walk away with today is the distinction between the two. And so I tried to make it as simplistic as possible to show you how different they are. So if you can see in the capital words there, this is how I want you to distinguish them. Being trauma-informed means you're building an awareness, and being trauma-responsive means you're taking that awareness and you're adapting that to responding. So when we think about being trauma informed, we know that because this is a universal experience that people have, we know that walking into a courthouse is already going to be triggering for people. And they could be having a response to being in the courthouse that might not be necessarily why the reason they're there, but maybe something that happened to them 20 years ago. It's not for you to decide or be the scientist or the social scientist or the doctor in that moment. It's just for you to know that you want to build in a framework and safeguards for people to feel safe. So we want to predict what are some things we can put in place that are trauma informed. For example, we want to be able to have Kleenex available for people who get upset. We want to be able to have a water fountain or bottles of water available for people to calm themselves down, because we know cold water is actually really good for deactivating the brain when we are elevated. We want to be able to have policies and procedures for people to be able to use their voice when they feel like they need to put some input into if the court is doing some type of restructuring or a youth advisory board or things of that nature. We want to make sure that a female identifying person walking into the courthouse can say that they aren't comfortable with a male identifying security guard if that's the case based off of their past experiences. So it's all of these things that you want to put in place because we know that the number one predictor for people who are being triggered by trauma is to help them feel safe. There needs to be a perceived sense of safety. So that's, if you think about building a house and the scaffold or the framework of a house, that's the trauma-informed pieces. That's actually the foundation that we want to lay. Being trauma responsive means you cue in and notice that there is a shift in a person's behavior. And you don't need to guess what the behavior is. You just need to be able to say, okay, I can tell this person's having a hard time, so I just need to be able to respond to that. You don't need to think about a script that you need to say. You don't need to think of what are the magic words that I can say to this person to make them feel better. All you simply need to do is respond. And one way you can do that is saying, hey, I know I can see you're having kind of a hard time, or I saw a shift in your behavior. How can I help? And again, this isn't you letting them off the hook. This isn't you not holding them accountable. It's just saying, hey, I see that you're having a hard time. Let's work together to figure this out. And so I'm hoping that kind of distinguishing factor can help you understand between the two, that being trauma informed is actually very different than trauma responsive. And so I put this up on another slide for you to look at, possibly a little bit differently. I'm a very visual learner, and so I think about things in terms of charts and flow charts and pictures and pie charts and just annoying things. My head is always going through like a constant filing cabinet of visuals to help me remember things. But if you're somebody that learns like I do, then the bottom of the slide will be very helpful when you think about awareness with the arrow to action. That's all informed to responsive is. So we're creating awareness to be trauma informed. We're integrating those things and institutionalizing them in a good way to make them our procedures and policies, to make sure we have these safeguards already written into the structure of the courthouse, no matter who's on the bench. It takes into account the experiences that people have had, not just right now, not in the moment of being in court, but for their lifetime and for all court personnel, the whole team. You're all bringing in a lifetime of experiences with you. And it is foolish to believe that you can leave all of those things in your car in the parking lot and go to work. You also will be triggered by things that happened to you 15 years ago, 15 months ago, yesterday. I think we've built this stigma around it's not okay to have a reaction. It's the human experience. It's just how you manage it is the thing that we need to be talking about. And then again, so we're moving from that awareness to responsiveness for how you're responding in the moment and creating safety. When we think about trauma, it's actually very linear in the way it happens. It is non-linear in the way it is managed and you respond from here on out. So I'm hoping that makes sense. When we think about the linear nature, it is an event that happens to someone, and Tina did a really great job about explaining that with the definition a couple slides ago. It can be a single event, it can be a repeated event, it can happen to an individual, it can happen to a group, it can be systemic, it can be random, or it can be purposeful. So it's some sort of event that when the person experiences it is so jarring that it actually can chemically stamp their DNA and their nervous system and rewire their brain to believe that they are psychologically or physically unsafe, and that they perceive all of those things like something that could, for example, like people can have a certain scent. It's very scent like sensory based. Somebody can walk into a room and the lighting can remind them of something awful that happened to them 10 years ago, and boom, they're triggered. They could have a certain scent of a perfume, of a cologne, of a laundry detergent, of something musty in the back of the room, and remember an awful abusive event that happened to them as a child. Their in the moment experience can say to themselves, oh my gosh, I'm 45 years old. Why am I reacting like this when this happened when I was 5? But the tricky thing about your nervous system is not on a timeline. It doesn't work on a clock. It only works off of memory. So it's really important to understand that all of these things are very complicated. The effects can happen for a lifetime. We cannot, and Tina mentioned this, we cannot erase trauma. What we're looking to do is reduce the impact of how people react by just being a safety net and a safeguard. Again, not excusing accountability, but just being a safety net to help them feel safe so that they can be workable and collaborative. Anything you'd like to share on that one, Tina? Did I
No,
miss
I think
anything?
I love this slide. I think it's very helpful. And I also like that you talked about how you're visual, and my slides tend to be visual, but then not have the little arrows.
I do like a good arrow, that's for sure. Okay, so now we're moving into objective 3. So we're going to recognize and build awareness of data related to trauma. So for those of you who haven't heard of adverse childhood experiences, it's a study that's been around for a really long time. And if you have heard of it, excellent. If you haven't, that's okay too. We don't expect for you to, so we're just going to give you a really broad overview of it. It was a study that was done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente back in 1995. It ran for 2 years. It was a longitudinal study, meaning that they tracked results over time and data. So from 1995 to 1997, they interviewed 17,000 adults about their life experiences up to the age of 18. And what they wanted to know is, okay, people are now starting to talk about this thing called trauma. We know that awful things happen to people, but what is the impact when something happens to you as a child later on in life? Does it have any sort of correlation or relationship to poor health outcomes as adults or across the lifespan? And lo and behold, the answer they found out is, I'm going to give you a second just to think. Do you think there's a connection? Yes or no? Yeah, there is a total connection. And so what they found is they could break trauma down basically into 4 different categories: abuse, neglect, household challenges, and other types of adversity. I won't go through this list. This is not just limited to this. These are just examples. We can think about something that just happened a few years ago. We could put COVID on here. That definitely would fall under other adversity, could probably fall under household challenges as well. It's a really important thing to take into consideration. But what the study found is that, okay, we can take all these experiences that these 17,000 people talked about, and when we code them, we can break them into 4 different categories. So again, yes, childhood experiences shape health later in life. What they found is the latest statistic was in 2023. I would argue that now in 2026, this percentage has definitely gone up, but this is overwhelmingly over half of the population of people have had at least one adverse childhood experience. That's just out of people that reported it. So think about how many people didn't quite come to the awareness or understanding of, oh, what happened to me really was a trauma. It takes a lot of courage to be able to admit that, like, hey, yeah, those things that happened to me were pretty bad. So we know that the base is 64%. I would argue that's actually higher. We also know that 25% of adults have three or more. So when you're thinking about, okay, well, how does this impact the justice system? Youth that come into your courtroom, 90% have at least one adverse childhood event, have been exposed to trauma, and 75% of adults. Another really interesting statistic is 70% of adults that are involved in the criminal justice system came from foster care. So that tells you that statistic is really important to cue in on, because think about how someone ends up in foster care. Think about the traumatic experiences that led to that point, removal, being placed in a new family. And what we also know about foster care is that sometimes not the greatest things happen in foster care. And now we have this pipeline that leads into the criminal justice system as adults. So that's something to keep in your mind. When we go back and we look at the impact that ACEs has later on in life for our personal health, 4 or more exposures to adverse childhood events lead us as adults 2 times more likely to smoke, 2.5 times more likely to have a sexually transmitted infection, 4 times more likely to have a pulmonary disease, chronic, 7 times more likely to identify as an alcoholic, 10 times more likely to inject street drugs, 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. That doesn't even explain all of the suicidal ideation, but we're talking about attempts here. And half of the leading causes of death are associated with ACEs. So that's some pretty important data to wrap your head around of, okay, now we know that when we're working with especially children in court, that we are trying our best to mitigate the impact that their trauma will have on them so that later in life they have better health outcomes. And then I'm going to go over this slide, and then Tina has a little story to support all of this for you. So I'm going to just continue here about what this means for you. So a review of judicial research and studies show that 63% of judges show symptoms of vicarious trauma. 63 to 83% of court personnel show symptoms of vicarious trauma. 50% of jurors report symptoms of vicarious trauma after one jury session, jury duty. And then 11% and 30% of judges meet criteria for PTSD. You might look at this statistic and say, gosh, well, this seems lower. But the general population, the top percentage of people that are actually diagnosed with PTSD nationally is 7%. So when we're talking about the overrepresentation and the disproportionality within the group that you work in, you are substantially clinically higher and more at risk to have full-blown criteria for PTSD. This isn't even symptoms. So it's really important, again, that you cue into that quote at the bottom of the screen, is that we know that you will be impacted. So that's why it's really important that you take care of yourself, because the repeated exposure gives you no other room to run. It's an unavoidable impact that's going to happen.
The story I have about what this means to you, at juvenile court, when I was working there, we brought trauma training into the courthouse, and we trained everybody on it. And that awareness piece, that trauma informed, just making sure people understood it. And a lot of it was because we were serving this population that had all these ACEs and all of that stuff. And what we found when we were training staff, it's like how many of them had ACEs and how many of them realized, oh, it's not just the people we're dealing with, it's us as well. And so that just spoke volumes as to what we've been saying, that it's kind of compounded. So not only we want to help the people, but our own staff are dealing with this as well. And so that just brought home when we were talking about it, and somebody like realizing And it was one of the individuals that was profoundly impacted. It's like, wow, now I know why I'm so angry. Maybe it was one of our security, and it was a contracted security. It wasn't even an employee. It was we had the people that wanted people attend this trauma training to be aware of as well. So I just wanted to, it's not, maybe it's not under your purview, but it might be court employee adjacent. Like we were talking about the attorneys that are coming in as well. So I just wanted to make that note.
Yeah. And when we talk about what's under your purview, this next slide is going to be pretty shocking, I think, because this is actually under a national purview. When we look at ACEs related illnesses and the cost of this, annual $748 billion annually just out of North America in ACEs related illnesses. And one of the previous slides we were looking at, half of deaths are actually related to ACEs. But we look at how much money is being pumped into healthcare and illnesses and how much of that is actually related to trauma. $748 billion is a huge chunk of change. If we made intentional efforts to address ACEs, now there's a whole other piece of that called positive childhood experiences or PCEs. We won't get into that today, but that whole premise and notion is basically saying the more safeguards, connectedness, positive things we put in place, we know the research shows now will negate the impact of trauma. And that's what we're kind of talking about today. But that would also reduce that $748 billion by 10%, which gives us a pretty large savings in healthcare related illnesses.
All right, so we talked about this a little bit about how to recognize that. And I mentioned the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, but what else? What can we really say for our warning signs? And they're going to be that physical. Why am I so tired? I'm just get home. I'm drained. I have headaches. I always complained about muscle tension. It's like, okay, I got to go get a massage or something. But our bodies carry it. There's a famous book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? And so the cumulative effect on trauma can impact us physically, and our bodies are throwing out warning signs. Emotional, same thing I talked about, kind of that the irritableness, cranky, grumpy, snap short with people, but it also could be sadness or just hopelessness or I just can't, right? So there's that emotional drain as well. Cognitive is not be forgetful. Walk into the kitchen. What did I come in here for? Or I have a list of tasks. If I don't write them down, I'm not going to remember all of them. And some of that just might be we're juggling too many things, but these could be warning signs as well. Allison, stop laughing. We all do it, right? But then there's also the behavioral. We were talking about acting out, and that could be presenting within the workplace. Then you start looking at the absentee, the illness. But one of the things I also found in the literature is it could also be overworked. Like people who like stay at work all long hours. And so part of that might be because they don't have enough bandwidth to get the job done within the allotted time. So they need more. Or you flip it around, they might not want to go home to whatever's at home. So there's all of these warning signs, but a lot of it for us is to recognize it within ourselves first. But then to, like Allison mentioned, we got to like acknowledge that if we're seeing it in other people as well.
So let's talk a little bit about the impact that it has on you. We are talking about elevated work hours. Tina mentioned that in the last slide. So when that happens and you spend more time in a place where you are more exposed, that means that on the flip side, you're spending less time in places that are protective, that are less exposed. So this is not good for you. Now, what's really hard about this piece is that when you are really caring, you care about your job, you care about your performance, you care about everyone around you, you tend to overwork. And when you overwork, it's really hard to turn that switch off. When you've been exposed to other people's trauma, there is a hypervigilance and hyperindependence that also kicks in alongside of your natural drive to do well. That is a very deadly combination because it makes it very hard for you to turn the switch off because you keep thinking you have to just get to the next thing. This causes less sleep and sleep disturbance, which means that there's less time for you to take care of yourself. Which also means, like I said before, the more you're at work, the more that you are exposing yourself and you have more of a repeated exposure. Less connection with your support system, the emotional dysregulation, flying off the handle at things you necessarily shouldn't be flying off the handle at. Being mad at, sure. Being irritated, yes. But the big reactions that we have to things when we talk about, when I used to teach emotional regulation to elementary school students, we'd always talk about the size of the problem and the size of the reaction, which should equal each other, right? And my kids are teenagers and they love to point that out to me when I have an overreaction about thing of like, Mom, your reaction was larger than the problem. But when you start to see that there is a pattern with that, this is when we're talking about the most emotional dysregulation. You are on edge, you are always activated, you have a large amount of cortisol being pumped through your body. So it's harder for you to hit the brakes and respond how you normally would in a more, I hate to say appropriate way, but a way that's more conducive to how you normally would respond. Okay. You might have concentration difficulties. And again, clinically significant levels of PTSD that could actually qualify you for a diagnosis, or not even PTSD, but anxiety symptoms, depression symptoms, some substance abuse disorder, and all of those things. And anxiety and depression oftentimes go hand in hand. We call that a comorbid disorder. So if you do have symptoms of PTSD, more than likely you're also dealing with a little bit of anxiety. You're also dealing with a little bit of depression. And none of these things are good. And there shouldn't be a stigma around that. It just means that you don't feel good. And that is your cue to really step in and take care of yourself. So let's look a little bit at the warning signs, okay? So we know that 21 million cases of depression are also ACEs related. That's pretty staggering when you look at that number. 1.9 million cases of heart disease are ACEs related, and 2.5 million cases of obesity are also ACEs related. If you take a look at these charts at health conditions, health risk factors, and socioeconomic challenges, if we put proactive interventions in place to really address childhood trauma, this is the amount that we would reduce these illnesses and conditions. So we would reduce obesity, diabetes, cancer, heart disease. We would reduce smoking and heavy drinking. We would increase employment. We would increase high school education. We would increase access to health insurance. So all of these things move in a positive direction when we really start to try to mitigate trauma. And of course, there's a piece about grief and loss. When we talk about experiencing our own personal trauma or being exposed to somebody else's trauma, there is a experience of grief and loss. It doesn't have to be a death for you to grieve something. It doesn't have to be a death for you to feel a sense of loss. And for the longest time, the research talked about, okay, well, if you're going through the grieving process, it's going to be stages of grief. That's actually not true, and it doesn't apply to the general population. What it is, it's a style, it's not a stage. This is also nonlinear. So your result to trauma exposure does have a loss component. And we're going to get into the second session of this webinar is going to talk more about grief and loss and what those styles are and what those really mean, and to build some awareness around if you're noticing a heavy sense of loss, that's normal. That's not something to feel bad about or disadvantaged about. It just means that these two things go hand in hand. Hearing about someone's worst moments of their life repeatedly, of course, is going to make you feel bad. And so this, like I said, is normal. We're just doing this to talk about building awareness. When we talk about vicarious grief, it aligns with vicarious trauma. It means that how you feel is going to mirror how the other person is experiencing their own grief and loss and bereavement. It follows the same symptomology as PTSD and vicarious trauma. none of this is going to make you feel good. There's going to be a real sense of heaviness here. And so that's why it's important that we talk about it to normalize it, because we know that these things are all linked. And again, emotional weight is really heavy and it needs attention. And when we get to the second part of this webinar, we'll all talk about some strategies and things that you can do to take care of yourself. Okay. Develop tips for self-care. Here we go. We are cruising right along. I'm looking at the time here, 12:48. Tina, we are doing great. Okay. So let's talk a little bit. This is where you get to utilize the chat for just a minute. Tina and I have the same perspective on self-care, which is that it's not always this luxurious bath you get to take. It's not taking yourself out for a really nice meal, although those things are really nice. It's not just about the massage, although that is also really nice. It's much more than that. So I want you to think about, to you, what does self-care mean? And I'd like for you to drop that in the chat for us. And we'll take just a moment and see what kind of answers come in. Therapy, exercise, time off. Yep, reading a novel. For those of you that are like, I have no idea what self-care is, you're going to get a lot of ideas in the chat. So I would say take a screenshot of that or take a photo with your phone. Rachel, art, of course. Yeah. So now I want you to think of the flip side of that question. What is it not? Melinda, yes, work boundaries. Hard to do, but yes. So what is it not? Mm-hmm. Yes, Mallory.
Yeah. Doing everything for everyone and not checking in with yourself or overextending yourself and not sleeping. It's kind of that overworked concept that we talked about, right?
Yeah.
Oh, Jonathan, I feel like you're calling me out. Alcohol is not self-care.
Pretending I am fine. Yeah. Isolating. Yes, Maria. Living in constant survival. We've got a lot of great awareness in the chat. And so for those of you who are still kind of thinking, I'm just going to ask you, look through and see what how other people have answered and see if that can kind of help shape an answer that you have. It's really important that you start thinking about self-care as foundational strategies that you intentionally choose to build healthier habits. Doing all the luxurious things are really nice, and that's a perk. But building in sustainable habits to take care of yourself is really important and also challenging when you are in a position that's an act of service. All of you are working in an act of service. All of you probably are caretakers in some way or some shape or form in your life. When you have that combination, you will put yourself on the back burner every time. So doing something for yourself feels selfish, but that is a incorrect construct. And so I want you to really challenge yourself to saying no is hard, but you're the only one that can do it. Putting boundaries in place are extremely difficult when you've already developed a work reputation and a style of how you work and everything is performative. You're the only person that can do it. And the systems that we work in reward over performance. And so you are working against the grain, but at what cost? Because we know the data shows that there are negative health outcomes later on down the road. And if you don't make time to rest, your body will make sure that you make time for it later. And so we all have a little stubborn streak. We all think that we are immune to certain things, but when you get hit with a health condition or concern, that is a wake-up call that your body has been sending you warning signs for a really long time. So I don't mean to lecture you. I'm just saying, start taking care of yourself.
All right, so some basic tips. We've heard these things, right? They're in our self-care, and it's some of it is some like mantra, where you got to eat right, exercise, get rest, all these things. But want to really stress the importance. These are not luxuries. These are actually foundational tools. Like Allison was saying, you got to build that sustainability. How are we going to make sure that our everything isn't going to tank after and all of this cumulative stress finally decides to rear its ugly head? How do you mitigate it? And it's building this foundation. And I love the somebody everybody mentioned these things in the chat, getting outside, gardening, that's the hobbies kind of thing, making sure they get enough rest. That's absolutely self-care. Exercising. But some of these things, like Allison was saying, you think of them as luxuries. It's like, I can't afford a gym membership, right? Or I don't have time to go to the gym. But what can we do that can give us that walking around, just stepping outside, taking actual breaks? How many of us eat lunch at our desks, do not get up, and just stay indoors all day? Sunshine is a powerful tool. Okay, if you guys are living in one of those rainy states, I live in California and Arizona, there's all kinds of sunshine. So, but there's lights that I think that can help with that as well. But making sure that you're getting these things, and these are not our foundational, they're not luxuries. You have to find ways to have that nutritious balance of food, even though it's so quicker to run through the drive-through on your way home and getting the fast food. So that's kind of some of the tips. And then I'm going to turn it over to Allison because she has some great suggestions for you all. But again, take some note of some of the things that we have in the chat, and we will be delving a little bit more on some of these concepts in our next webinar.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so for those of you who have ever read the book Trauma Stewardship, just give me a little thumbs up in the chat if you have. It is a really helpful book that talks about people who are on, yes, Leah, it's a great book. There's a lot of great information and resources there. They have a institute that goes along with the book called the Trauma Stewardship, and this is the tiny survival guide that you're seeing on this slide here. If you ever feel like you need some ideas just to build in some strategies or sustainable practices, this is really helpful. I have mine hung up in my office right above my computer screen. I have two signs, one that says strolling, not scrolling, to remind me to get off of social media and go for a little walk when I need a break. And another one is the tiny survival guide. There's a lot of just different things that you can do on there. We hand this out at our wellness symposiums. I give this in every trauma presentation. Can I steal this? Yes, Maria, you sure can, with no penalty. Yeah, so this is just something that's really helpful. So I'll give you just a second if you want to snap a photo with your phone, if you want to take a screenshot, whatever it may be. This is just something that's really helpful, just as a reminder. And again, when we talk about the self-care to team care principle, there is the herd mentality and the group cohesion that really helps hold people accountable. And so it's really nice to hang this up in a common space. It's really nice to be able to say to a colleague or coworker, hey, I'm going to work on getting outside this week. What are you going to work on? And doing things together, because really the team aspect is really important. We work in a system, so why not work together as a team?
Before you move off of this, the go outside, and like I made that comment about if it's rainy and it's not sunny, there actually is some studies that say just even looking at nature pictures. So even just either looking outside or looking at nature, and you pull up your Bing or whatever your screensaver is, and it's a lovely shot. Sometimes I live in that. I go there for a moment before actually opening up all of the emails.
And you want to know what? We didn't even practice that because I was just going to talk about on the next slide, blue space, green space that falls under Monday morning moments. So what Tina is talking about is this research principle called blue space, green space. And what that means is blue space being the sky, water, green space being nature, that there is a ton of research backing the mental health benefits of being outdoors. If you can't get outdoors, you can create blue spaces and green spaces in your office, in your break rooms, and places like that. And those have maybe not 100% the same impact as it would be if you went outside, but it has close to. So Monday Morning Moments is one of the judicial wellness initiatives that I oversee, and it is a free program that we offer once a month. I bring on a mental health professional or a judge who is really in tune to wellness, and they talk about different principles and different things that have helped them. We have gone all the way from how to make smoothies to grief and loss during the holidays, to blue space, green space, to mindfulness on the bench, to the nervous system and using horse therapy, to chair yoga that we had last week. So we have 8 seasons that are all on demand on our website. 54 episodes. I have people contact me all the time asking, hey, how can I use some of these episodes to help train my team? I am always here to help. I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to go ahead and zip it here and pass it over to Tina to finish this up.
So we talked about moving from self-care to team care, and I have to do this in 2 minutes, but luckily we are going to have our second webinar, which I really want to talk more in depth about that. But just thinking about team care, it is a double-edged sword. We do have a lot of benefits that Allison mentioned, that connectedness. I love putting up that tiny survival guide in a common area, because talking about these things and talking about trauma and just having a space for people to talk about it is going to really be helpful. I don't know how many times I've said this, but my family doesn't understand what I do for work. They don't understand the environment that I work in. My dog does not. When I come home from work, he's not very helpful when I'm dealing with all of these things. But the people that we work with, they understand, they know. So having these dialogues within your organization is super helpful. Again, and then even being able to recognize when that somebody is off or there's something wrong and saying, hey, how's it going? Are you okay? And being seen. Unfortunately, the barriers you're going to, as administrators, as managers, as supervisors, when do I have time to do this? I don't have a lot of resources for these things. But hopefully in our next webinar, we can get to some more practical, easily identified practices that you can develop for your teams. But the other thing that Allison mentioned was that social stigma about being trauma, even like saying I'm traumatized, or this is weighing on me, or being upset. I remember when I first started working for the courts, I talked about that clerk being that armor and being that stoic, and that some of the higher ups did not appreciate when somebody said, I can't be in this hearing because it was a child abuse case and I have grandchildren and I cannot listen to this. It becomes, oh, well, you can't do your job. So there are things that we can really look at and make sure that our leadership knows this is something we need to be having conversations about. So that way, what do we do when that does happen? If one of our team members can't function in that environment, how do we accommodate that? So those are some of the barriers.
And when we look at power in numbers, why group connection matters. The research and the personal experiences that you have will align with this, that it helps you recover from anxiety quicker, stress quicker, depression quicker. There is a lot of power in group cohesion. It can lower your cortisol level. It actually supports immune function, provides a sense of belonging, and combats loneliness and isolation. When we think about the grief and loss component, people who are grieving, and we talk about the grieving styles, the loneliness and the isolation feels so heavy. Having a sense of belonging with a group is really important. And it improves your mood and self-esteem. So knowing yourself in a way that is helpful to put some own individual self-care strategies in place for yourself is really important. And it's equally as important that you do things as a group.
So finally, and again, I would love for us to delve into this, but guess what? We will be. The National Center does have some tools and some tips on how to identify and some of the recommendations for your team. You can do screening. There are recognition and screening tools that are available to see if somebody is going through vicarious trauma. You also have support programs. Every court should have an employee assistance program. But the problem is a lot of people don't use them, or tell employees what they are or explain the benefits or why it's so important that they utilize it. We also have this training, that trauma-informed piece, making sure people even understand it. And that's why when I went to the juvenile court and we started training everybody all the way down to the janitorial staff on what does trauma look like, it really gave everybody that understanding. And then the next piece is that responsiveness. How do we respond? Workplace culture itself, making sure your leaders are aware of this and that they're supportive of making sure that your policies and your procedures and stuff are not making an impact on your staff or your teams. So those are some of the suggestions. Some of those are the recommendations from the National Center and other experts. But again, we will be talking to you all. So coming next is our next webinar. I think we're trying to say October
Yep.
19th at noon.
Yep. Yes.
Good.
Hopefully.
We're so excited.
Yeah, we're so excited. And this next webinar will be extremely collaborative. And so even if we have this many people come, we will utilize breakout rooms, but be prepared to share some strategies and some tips on what you have been doing that you think work, or things that you want to try, but you're not quite sure how you'd be able to roll them out. So we're really going to be leaning into each other and helping each other out with this.